Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Forest stage at ETH Barcelona. We're going to have a panel right now aligning economic incentives to be regenerative by design. And our panelists are Alejandra Borda from 50 Years, Eiman Soliman from Crowdmuse, and Will Rowe from Protein. So I want to bring our barefoot panelists up. This is actually grass here, if you guys want to feel the grass there. Come on up. Welcome. Give them a hand. Thank you.
Which one? You want to go in the middle?
Yeah, sure. Oh, wow, this is very zen.
All right. It feels good. It's real.
Well, thank you for coming. Well, I'm Alejandra, Eiman, and Will, and thank you guys for joining as well. And I think as just a context on like the panel, I think what the main idea that we wanted to explore is that we always talk about like regenerative finance, or even like whenever it comes to philanthropy or like bottom lines or ESG, it's like some businesses have like their own negative externalities, and then they have a subset of their profits going towards like philanthropic causes or different doing good services, and then but those like subset of like profits going there are just like a small percentage of the multiple orders of magnitude externalities that they usually create in the world. And we have like the solutions of like, oh, B Corps, ESG, impact-driven companies, impact entrepreneurship. And now we want to explore like one step further towards there, instead of just like trying to make up for bad externalities, or instead of trying to make as most positive impact as possible, how do we actually reach regenerative businesses that are actually like improving the earth, improving our living economies, and doing so in a way that are in alignment with new economic thinking, with the like health of the people, of the environment, of aligning actually economic incentives towards that is not driven by growth or production, etc., but rather how do we kind of like engineer the design system or the game in which we play, that so that companies or projects or people can be like regenerative from the get-go. That's why it's like regenerative by design. And I wanted to first start. I have two like amazing projects. Many of you might not know them because, or maybe yes, because they're, Crowdmuse just launched their mirror post on like what their approach is today. And Protein, yes. And Protein has been added for a few months or years, I'm not sure.
In between, yeah. Just about a year, yeah.
So I wanted to let you guys introduce a little bit of like, what are you guys involved in? What is Protein? What is Crowdmuse? And let's start there.
Cool. Hey guys, I'm Will. I'm not Gus. Gus sends his apologies. I'm founder of Protein. Really excited to be here. Thanks for the invite, Ale. We are an impact DAO. We've been running just over a year now. Very much looking at what we call good growth. So it's rethinking how we make decisions ultimately. The analogy we use is a sort of a Web3 B Corp. So it's sort of bringing a lot of that thinking and frameworks and standards into a Web3 world. And through that, hopefully also improving it. And eventually, like Holy Grail is definitely getting to sort of a regenerative place. So yeah, that's us.
Great. Yeah, Eiman. I'm working with Crowdmuse. I guess quick background, because it's a really hard thing to explain, but I'm a systems engineer. I started off in energy and climate tech, and we were looking at kind of optimizing supply chains around energy and plastics. And then I realized those were the most boring supply chains. And so with the team, we've kind of been looking at some of the more product-facing, consumer-facing products that we can kind of create co-ownership models around and really bring the product creation process on chain. Really making sure that everyone that has contributed to that value chain, whether it's a supplier, a designer, someone that's actually producing it, or a community of people producing it, make sure that those, the value and the ownership of those products are kind of replenished back into the system. So that's really the background, and I think what I'm most excited about this conversation is really breaking it down. When we say regen, what does it mean? We really need to redesign a lot of these systems so that instead of just kind of taking a Web 2, Web 3 spin on things, see how do we redesign the incentive systems that kind of share value, distribute value, and understand where value creation really happens to make sure that there's not organizations that try to extract that value, actually use those value-generating nodes to replenish the rest of the system. So excited to be here.
Cool, thank you. And on that note, what would you guys define as a regenerative business or a regenerative funding model?
I mean, simply, it's sort of something that gives back more than it takes. Yeah, I think on a fundamental level, and this is a challenge in any system that's already out there. We were chatting earlier about the existing models, the existing worlds, the existing businesses, organizations, and ultimately it's also a human question. We're the problem as part of this, right? If we really want to create change, it's up to us as individuals to sort of be that change. But yes, to answer your question, it's something that gives back more than it takes.
What would you say?
That's a good one. So regenerative systems, or also the financial part, just to see which
Regenerative
tangent.
systems or a regenerative business model, like how would you describe that?
Yeah, I really like the definition you gave. I kind of view things as systems, and in a system there's something that goes in and something that comes out. And so regenerative means whatever comes out replenishes what needs to go in. And in our typical structures right now, usually what happens is there are, let's say, actors in the middlemen that kind of use their privilege or ownership of a certain system to try to extract more value from it than they put in. So I think what we need to try to design together is a way to spot what types of systems are essential for solving the problems that we face across climate change, poverty, homelessness, and try to redesign those systems so they're more regenerative, both in how the value is created and how that value is distributed.
Yeah, I vibe with that because it's like, usually right now how our model operates is mostly just production, growth, consumption, and then, for example, I always use the analogy of Peru, Costa Rica. I'm from Peru, and you would eat one papaya, for example, in Costa Rica, and you will be super nourished and not be hungry at all in the entire day. But then you come here, or to the States or to anywhere else, and it's the fast agriculture that is just producing a lot, and you have a lot of ingredients, massive amount of quantity, but your body is not nourished. So how could we enable for us to kind of assign value to that which actually improves and enhances the human experience, our human experience on Earth and with each other, and then assign value to that and optimize for kind of those outcomes to be able to assign monetary value to those eventually that right now are kind of not within the system. Yeah, I want one of the main questions there as well is how do we assign monetary value to those things that are right now very abstract and very not included in our financial models of economy, growth, production, etc.
It's a good question.
Great question.
I mean, it's incredibly subjective. Theory of value is, very much a personal, viewpoint. If you want to value a bottle of water for someone who's really thirsty, who's not. But ultimately, I think it's looking at that bigger picture of, as I said, those drivers and really what is creating that demand, what is creating that, need of consumption. And, we've looked a lot at, stepping back from before we get to regenerative, growth. And, we launched our DAO around this mission about redefining growth, and why we call it good growth. It's post-growth, degrowth, all the variations of growth, because it's, that's ultimately what's driving this change, right? So I think if we can really understand even just the language hence your first question of like what this is and isn't and how we understand it, that's really going to help shape and define, how we even perceive value. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but it's the ultimate question in terms of how we understand this challenge, for sure.
Yeah, because one of the things you can do with Web3 kind of thing is like you can create the tools or the mechanisms for communities, and we can deploy tools for any community around the world. That's why I can like decentralization to input their values and their like preferences on what they want to grow. And sometimes it's the thought of, is it enough to just like give more power to the edges for them to decide like what is more important for their community with connection to whatever they believe on, versus also trying to create these like design systems on railroads and games in which actually people are steered or encouraged, like nudge a little bit more towards those like regenerative actions by design.
Yeah, no, agreed. I don't know if you got any thoughts.
Yeah, I think maybe just starting at the definition of value, there's many different ways that we think of it. One is the, let's say, market, how the market values certain things. There's other things like how we price products, but also just like the value that communities create that are not necessarily measurable. So yeah, just the random tangent, but I think the way that we value our, let's say, older generations, the people that can't bring tangible value to this world, is very clear that the way we live our lives, we need to make a lot of money so that when we become a bit less valuable, we have enough to kind of sustain ourselves. And I think even that system, which is a little bit more, let's say, social and less technical, I think there's an important part of both understanding how we're identifying value, and I think Gitcoin does that well by assigning all the different types of value. The other side is, do you actually want to create currency that measures that value, or do you want to distribute that value directly to the people? So I think money, if you see it as like an energy storage device, the same way that a battery stores energy from solar, and you kind of store it in a battery and then use it when you need it, money kind of looks in the same way. So you make money, you put it into some kind of currency or gold, and then you can use it later. So maybe money actually, or the way that we look at value, doesn't necessarily need to be translated to a certificate or a currency. We can actually reconstruct the systems that flow value to the people that contribute and create it.
In a decentralized way.
In a decentralized way. That's the dream.
Wait, I wanted to double click on that one. I think you mentioned before as well, like earlier, how we could have two different ways, or many ways, but mainly we mentioned two ways of value flows, and how like information, impact, outcomes flow between each other. One could be like the ever-flowing impact or ever-flowing actions that then get like attribution by other actors, and then the other one was more of a kind of like milestone or stepwise function of like, oh, I did this impact, this outcome, I have an impact NFT or impact certificate about the action that I made, and like very stepwise function. Could you like double click on how you see those?
Yeah, so I think as we mentioned, let's give an example so it's a little bit more defined, but everyone talks about CO2 credits, and just a quick byline of how that works. Hopefully I get it right. If I don't, someone catch me later and update my knowledge.
Someone from Toucan here, I'm sure.
Yeah, we gotta, but at its base theory, not looking at the actual technical side of it, it's someone creating a certificate and saying there was some kind of CO2 saved. So for the like tonnage in terms of value, and then over a year, which is kind of the duration that that CO2 is stored, that in itself can create a certificate. The other ways of doing that is saying that as the CO2 is concerned, or if there's an energy product that doesn't have, for example, that footprint, you actually share in the value of that product in a way. So I think both systems work. There's a certification system, and then there's like a tradable system that doesn't necessarily need to be stored. That's one side. But the stepladder approach that you mentioned, do you mean more of a like the transition that we're talking about before we go full decentralized, or something more around how the value is distributed?
Yeah, I was talking about collaborative IPs and collaborative business models versus impact certificates out of specific actions.
I see. Yeah, so on the same topic that we're talking about, so the way that we look at products, at least on the Crowdmuse side, it's any product that's sold, whether it's a piece of clothing or energy for your home or actually getting access to kind of a living space. These are all products that have a chain of activities that may have some kind of footprint associated with it. So the way that we're trying to kind of establish a non-skeuomorphic example of this, it's saying that as you create a product that has some kind of value in terms of both utility and some kind of offset, can you link that to the technologies, the IP that was able to create that product?
And the people themselves.
And the people. And so when someone buys that energy, if we can create co-ownership models around buying products that are using the best technologies, that have the best footprint, the decision-making behind which product to buy to have the lowest footprint actually becomes incentivized because you want to own the technology that is producing the most sustainable product. So I think we can start linking a lot of these things that have in the past been in silos because organizations wanted to kind of create a business model out of that small section. What we're able to do is create a decentralized map of actors that can bridge the sale of a product to the IP that was developed to create that product at the lowest impact.
Yeah, it's great. We had Jesse Baker on the podcast from Provenance. It's similar but different, but very much Web 2 focused supply chain in terms of just understanding impact, understanding consumption, you know, at every point trying to, understand, its value. It's hard though, right?
It is.
There's a lot of steps there.
There's the measurement side, there's the actual contribution and who created the value. And these can all play out in different ways. So it's not about whether it's an impact certificate or shared IP. It's actually how do you create new incentive loops that have never existed. So both creating certificates of value and product ownership. And I think the market or the network of contributors that care about the outcome will evolve into the solution that we end up with.
Yeah, just referencing Jesse's comment around blockchain, and actually they launched 2014, which is early in blockchain years, and that was a key part of the pitch. But more recently, it's very much behind the scenes pitch, right? It's the plumbing rather than the actual story. And then I think, again, it comes back to just a consumer behavior of just whether people, do people care? I hope they care, but there's a lot of people who don't. And how much of this story or how much of the solution is in the technology or how much of the solution is just, shifting mindsets of just, this is how we need to be thinking. But the fact that we're here talking about it and the fact that I think on the general, maybe we should do a Google Trends search on regenerative as a word. But, it's definitely becoming much more common in, conversation. Or I don't know how many projects here are working on impact or regenerative projects, but actually we can ask. How many people are working on impact or regenerative projects? Sweet. See the future. Yeah.
No, yeah, but I think that aspect is really top of mind for me always.
Yeah.
That blend between changing mindsets, re-inspiring imagination capacity of people to actually create new systems, create new change, or even just aligning with their own selves and what they're doing, what they're eating, how they're experiencing, the internal shifts that will naturally transition towards the positive actions. Kind of as you mentioned, the internal development goals, and tackling the individual or the collective at a consciousness or idealism level versus meeting people where they're at in a sense of awareness or incentive, internal incentive towards engineering those actions by design. I don't know if you guys are doing trying to tackle both at the same time, or are you focusing on one or the other?
We're looking very much, as I said, around human behavior and really trying to understand, what are those decisions that why someone buys something ultimately, right? If we can shift and educate and this isn't just us, by the way, right? There's a lot of people doing this, but I think on our own area of this, and that is where standards do help, right? And they're definitely not the answer. But if it is an indicator that this represents a set of values, which B Corp or 1% of the planet or fair trade, for example, right? It's saying that this product has been certified or verified against a certain set of values, right? In terms of where it's supply chain, whether it's sourced, how it's scored, whatever it is. And that helps you make decisions as a consumer. But equally, that isn't the answer, right? It just is part of the story. And certainly from our point of view, that's where the technology can help. And as you know from supply chains, it's like, if you can prove irrefutably where whatever the product is come from, that's huge. Scan those pair of shoes, whatever it is. But ultimately, it's coming back to that. I'm just repeating myself. That shift in mindset of just consumers understanding the importance of this, right? Fundamentally, and yes, we can build the technology to enable it, but we need to create that understanding the demand of actually this is where we're going and this is what we need to change. So that's very much where we're at in terms of this. And it's a crude analogy, but as a Web3 B Corp, and no disrespect to B Corp, right? We are a B Corp, our agency's a B Corp, I'm a B leader, I preach it, but actually we know a lot about it, but it's not perfect, and there's a lot that can be actually relatively easily improved with Web3 in terms of transparency and decentralization and ultimately ownership, right? What we're putting out, or when we finish building it, will be as a public good, right? It's not ours, it's not us to charge a fee for based on your annual turnover, which is the B Corp model. It's something that we put out as a public good that other people can build on. It's just a different mindset, I guess. That's sort of how we're approaching it.
And I do love that approach because what ends up being is the information that's shared with people that are making decisions around which products to buy. And so far we've had, let's say, centralized actors saying this is our label, so you can trust us. I think the direction where this is going, and even the discussions we have outside of panels, it is exciting to see that there are going to be a lot of decentralized labels based on the projects that these, let's say, DAOs have been building, and almost like a reputation system. There is going to be this, let's say, ranking of which standards seem to be implemented the most based on, let's say, the ease of measurement, the simplicity of understanding where the footprint and how it was kind of measured and how it relates to other, let's say, footprint technology measurements. So on the CO2 side, it's more MRV, so having sensors that actually read the CO2 or NOx emissions, but across every single product that we're making, you do need this reputation system of a bunch of decentralized certification or validation engines, and then the user or the person that's actually buying those products will end up choosing based on all of that information. So it is at the end trying to support that decision to make sure that it's the easiest but also the most impactful.
Yeah, for sure.
And on the impact, like B Corps or other type of measurements, like what are some of the things you guys would change on the measurement systems that they use or things they measure?
I mean, how long you got? That's a bit mean.
Like, what would you measure as, like, even if it's right now unmeasurable, like, what would you try to?
I mean, the hardest thing is what we're talking about, right? Is the qualitative. Yeah, anything quant, by definition, is measurable, but it's the qualitative. And we're spending a lot of time looking at, qualitative behaviors that, just as a background, aside of our DAO, we have an agency consulting business, and we do a lot of consumer research. And a key part of that research is human behavior and helping people understand the difference between what people say and what people do, because it's a big difference, especially in a quantitative capacity. And you fill out surveys and you've got data, but actually, what people think and what people do It's not massively different, but it's, you know, it's sizably different. So that to me isn't really what's currently captured in more of a measurable, or sort of standardized measurable sort of mechanic of like B Corp. Because if you can start layering in, you know, the considerations for more of a qualitative approach, then, you know, you can actually start really trying to understand where these shifts are coming from, and, you know, as we sort of talk about, you know, help these organizations make better decisions. I mean, that's sort of the big plan in terms of the direction. But then on fundamental, as I've just mentioned, it is transparency, right? It is decentralization. It is ownership. It's the fundamentals of Web3, of, you know, that currently don't exist within a B Corp construction. And also, and it sounds like I'm hating on B Corp, you know, you can technically be a gun runner, or actually a tobacco company, and also be a B Corp certified and hit your 80 points, right? There isn't, I mean, they frown upon it, but it's just a way of scoring like how you operate as a company, not actually what you do as a company. And I think that's a kind of a big question, and short of getting into what is the role of standards with the big guys, Denon's a B Corp, right? Evian, all of those, you know, products. And, you know, they put a lot of plastic into the world. And is that good or bad? You know, it's bad. But what is the role of, like, general certification if it can help them be less bad, right? Yeah, it's a big conversation. It's a big discussion. And, you know, because they are, and they're supporting a lot of businesses and a lot of companies and a lot of, you know, people in terms of their staff, but ultimately, they're only going to change until, you know, the actual consumer behavior starts changing and people stop buying Evian.
And what would you say, any of you, like to get a little bit practical, like what would you say what are the Web3 primitives or tooling that you have seen that could enable some mechanism design change from like the actual base layer?
I think the ones that I'm looking into at the moment and I'm most excited by, on one side, it's obviously the reputation systems, identity systems, because it's so early and there's many great examples. I think Disco is thinking it as more of like a data backpack, which has kind of a decentralized identity, and you can have different things, NFTs representing identities, and then you can have different types of reputations. So I could see that easily working for the transparency angle that you mentioned as well. And then things around superfluid or any type of streaming of value over time to a collective of people. Obviously, Coordinate, which kind of does contribution value style things. So we're looking across a few of these primitives. And from a Crowdmuse point of view, the thing that we're most excited about is the primitive that enables open source business model creation. So creating smart contracts that have all the interactions required to be able to create a real product and be able to on-chain measure everyone's contribution and have an open resource for people to kind of fork a business model and replicate that with their own suppliers or their own designers. And as soon as that we have that unlock, and there's going to be many other primitives that create more interesting bundles of innovation using 1 or 3 primitives, we're going to have just so many different ways of creating and distributing value and measuring it to make sure that we can track who gets what and grow together.
Yeah.
I think like that approach of like puzzle piecing all the different Lego pieces within Web3 or within like the money system and like the collaboration system, I think is super powerful, including like the like giving attribution to the different contributions that people made. For example, at 50 years, like we support a lot of founders, like mainly deep tech entrepreneurs, and like they need the financing early for like developing these biotech, hardware, climate technologies. But then we also have all of these other non-venture scalable businesses that we also want to see through in the world and support, which is why I'm mostly involved in like also the impact certificate, retroactive funding, and other Lego pieces that could support all of these projects or companies to come into reality. I think like one of the biggest pieces that is lacking in that impact certificates realm is that layer of like identity and contribution. Like who actually did this impact, and like all the actors and the supply chain across, like from IP to actual output. So definitely like a lot there to discover.
Yeah, but coming back to the carbon offsetting models, it's, you know, it's also if you've got that level, and I completely agree, right? It's incredibly early and it's all Lego blocks at the moment, and we're all working out which order to put them in. But if you can, you know, you fast forward, hopefully not too distant future, and it gets to a point where you can, on a personal level, be offsetting your carbon, your impact, you know, with the real world transactions. I mean, you know, I guess sort of the potential is there, right? And it's just now up to us and maybe some of these projects out here, you know, to actually make that, you know, make that a reality. So I don't know, I'm hopeful.
And do you think, and also, I don't know if there's a mic down on the back, but we're open to any questions if anyone has one. Yeah, and I was going to challenge if buying back carbon out of your normal purchases makes you a regenerative person or business just by buying it back.
Wait, say that again?
If you're like operating as normal as a human
Yeah.
being and buying what like anything else, being able to offset the carbon of whatever purchase you did, is that count as regenerative?
No. No, not
Okay,
in a true
perfect.
sense. It's net rather than positive. But, you know, it's a first step, right? If someone who has been, yeah, if that's their first step, it's, I don't know, it's like the first step to becoming a vegan is a vegetarian, right? So I think regenerative is the holy grail, but equally, I think we need to be realistic that we're not all going to get there. So it's like, how can we help? And, you know, this is a mass, you know, challenge of a, you know, of a generation to be sort of changing how they consume. Luckily, the younger generations are already plugged into it, that, you know, we can help them on this journey rather than say, right, they can only go here, right? You know, it's got to be steps, ladders, whatever the analogy is, for sure.
I know you had a question.
Yeah, do I need a microphone or should
I think people.
can hear you.
Yeah.
Cheers. You might disagree with the context for this, but if I look at the geopolitical... cheers. So if I look at the geopolitical situation, I would see the future as a resource-constrained environment, if you will, for a number of reasons. And I'm wondering how you see the regenerative proposition moving forward in a future that is resource constrained, potentially due to warfare. And the second, if I may just throw this one out, I saw a regenerative video on YouTube about helping the Amazon to regenerate itself. You talked about plastics before, so that's something that can't regenerate on its own. But silicon, if I remember, Wired had put out an article that sand was becoming less and less globally, and that's the basis for silicon. Wondering how you would take the theories you're talking about and applying it to the supply chain in the context of sand for the digital economy of the future. Either response to either of those would be appreciated.
I'll give a stab. Yeah, looking ahead, let's just say up until 2030, the word abundance is kind of thrown around in Web3, but the reality is there's going to be so many constraints as we move in, and especially when there's, let's say, nations that are just breaking the chasm of actually receiving energy access. There's also arguments saying, is it fair to actually ask people to leapfrog and not be able to, let's say, take energy or any other kind of product to be able to actually grow as a nation just because everyone else had that advantage earlier before we kind of realized we're making a lot of negative externalities. So I think in an ideal world, we would look at all of our resources, again, as a system. What are all our resources? Where does it need to go? And build a system that has the least value leakage or value extraction possible. And that's not possible because there's already people in place extracting that value in a way. So I think the fastest way to do this is to create kind of like a collective ownership of our supply chains. Again, I'm showing supply chains all day if anyone wants to learn more, but I think that's what it is finding our supply chains, making sure they're co-owned so that it's not third-party actors making decisions around where the value is distributed and how that value is used. It's the people that need those products and basically all of our basic needs like food, shelter, energy, clothing, community. So yeah, that'd be the plan. In a real world, I think the idea is to try to incentivize all the parties that are part of those supply chains to actually kind of create this collective ownership model and make sure that everyone feels like they're winning.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, you mentioned it's community, right? And cooperatives, and these models are old models, right? Cooperatives in terms of a legal status, certainly in the UK where I'm from. Yeah, it's just, again, I talk about mindsets, right? It's just a new way of thinking. And it's not a new way of thinking, but it's a new way for us as a generation to think. Because if you go back to war or global supply, it's not relatively that long ago that we came out of a world war and rationing and all of the implications that enforced. And let's hope we don't go there again. But it's, if we need to, we will do. And I hope, again, it's coming from both ends, right? For us as a human race to sort of change how we consume, but then equally, hopefully, some of the technology to actually help, make these systems better, for sure. Sand, I don't know anything about, sorry.
And I hope that by doing the collective ownership, maybe in some shape or form, we're actually tackling a little bit that tragedy of the commons, because now if we all collectively own the river, it's like, oh, if I dump into there, it's actually also affecting me, rather than like this separation from like, I'm in Europe and I don't see the Amazon, so I don't really have like any impact on there, like in like very fast like feedback loop. Any other questions?
Hi, Jeremy from Refi DAO. I'm really interested in the aspect of the impact certificate and where in subjective matters of what is good, what is bad, how you can leverage the crowd in that sense, or the people, the communities, those on the ground, the multi-stakeholders within the systems that you're creating.
What was the question?
So like if we've been talking about the qualitative aspect, which is obviously in the immutability of it, what we're going to be embedded into the blockchain, but then there are other aspects that are more subjective, like if something is good or bad, right? And what kind of impact it's having, and how are you going to be measuring that? How are you going to be integrating that? And is it something that you can leverage the communities and the multi-stakeholders in those systems? And have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is all we're doing. We haven't got the answer yet, full disclaimer, but those are the questions we ask. And in our Discord, we've got a channel, which Gus actually runs, called Tough Questions. And these are the tough questions that we need to really resolve. But as I said earlier, that there's enough data out there to help create a standard, but ultimately it needs to have that subjective, qualitative layer to humanize it. And it's hugely subjective, because what I might think is good might be completely different to what you think is good. And that's really what we're trying to build. It's hard to explain, but it's kind of more than a standard, right? It's a way of thinking, right? It's a way to help you understand what good is within the context of your environment or socioeconomics or situation, for you to think about how you consume differently. Underneath that, obviously, there is a base layer of a standard that is immeasurable, but ultimately it is that qualitative piece on top that it personalizes it, makes it relevant to the individual. We haven't got there yet. Working on it.
What comes to mind for me is like, previously I heard a lot about like, oh, markets are gonna kind of drive the the impact and like what is valuable for most because people are gonna fund it and like buy these certificates. People who care about it will buy what they care about seeing true in the world. But also that leads to like, okay, what if it's communities that don't really have like much financing? Then we come to pieces like quadratic voting, quadratic funding, where people just like contribute their preferences and signal their preferences on just like tiny donations. And then one final thing I would say, this is sounding, that says like
Yeah,
what,
we got 20 seconds left.
Yeah.
Take it all in.
I was not running against the time. But what I was saying is that I think two pieces are very powerful on like decentralizing the decision making, both to experts that know about the field, but also taking into account the communities themselves. So like you can decentralize it to experts that know the most about soil health in their communities, but if those are experts that are not, say we're dealing with like an indigenous community or something, if those experts are not tied to the cultural landscape of those people, then they're gonna override some things that might be very valuable for them that the community is actually more aware of. So I would say that like blending those two instead of one or the other, like might be one of the like cool concepts to explore as we decentralize power to the edges.
It's a great way to end it.
That was great.